Alright, this last video about this particular assignment, I want to take a step back and go back to, I guess, just the principle that I've talked about in class a number of times regarding just all of this being about communicating your design intent clearly. The last couple of videos, we were working towards creating a diagram that would clearly show how all of these different pieces came together. And at the end of it, you could see it was getting pretty busy, and as I continued to work with it after completing those videos, I decided that ultimately that wasn't going to be clear. And you are going to need to be able to make those kinds of decisions as you develop your diagrams too, just to say, hey, is this communicating what I want it to? And again, use a friend to run your diagrams by them and say, hey, can you understand what's going on here? So I'm just going to take this a few steps back and go back to where the model is laid out with your layers and your pins in place, showing how your model is actually constructed before you explode it in any way. And this is a part of the assignment, to have a diagram that looks something along these lines. It shows how everything fits together. Basically you're modeling what you created in paper, and with the pins you want to represent that as accurately as possible. And then we'll go from there and try a much simpler way of exploding this that should read a lot clearer, and then we'll go ahead and take that into Illustrator. Okay, so one way to keep this simple would just be to get the pins out of the way. That was the problem with the earlier videos. All the pins were just kind of intermingled, and it was really hard to read what was where. So one really simple way to keep this simple is to just pull the pins out so that they're completely separate, and then use another means for indicating how they all come together. One thing you might do is you can use like the side view to position your pins. That could be really helpful if you want to go for something that's real consistent in terms of the heights of your pins. And you can keep it that way, but for cleanliness, what I did is I actually I came up with raised pins that were all at the exact same level, so that they would read more clearly once we get them separated and exploded from the rest of the diagram. So what I'm going to do with those is just pull those way out of the way, and we'll hang on to this original drawing here because we're going to need that for this assignment as well. But I'm going to pull these way out of the way, and then I'm going to take copies of this geometry here and pull them up there as well. Let's see, did I get everything? I think so. Alright. Okay, so copied all those, pasted it, and I'm just going to pull all these up and then start separating them. And again, the goal with this is just make this read clearly. Actually, I'm going to copy this base as well and move that up. So we're going to need two separate two separate diagrams here. Alright, so, well, missed that. And this is all still really scrunched, so I'm going to move all of this up even further. Okay. Alright, so one real simple way to do this, and that manages to communicate real simply what's going on, is just to drop lines from all of these down to the base and call it a day. That's going to be a heck of a lot simpler than then situating them all at specific heights over each piece of geometry. So you can do that through something like, well, same process as before, just draw a line, although we'll need to use the line command with the vertical option so that it stays in the dimension that we want. Drop this all the way down to the base, and then what I can do to make this really simple so I don't have to do this a gazillion times, I'll resize this a bit because, like I mentioned before, we don't want it to look like it's part of the pin. And then I can use the copy command. This is different from Control-C, Control-V to copy something. The copy command will let you do multiple copies, and it will also let you pick a reference point as you copy it. So if I do the copy command, it works a lot like the move command, except you're doing it multiple times and it's producing a copy each time. So I'm going to select my line to copy, right-click to say I'm done selecting objects, and now it needs a reference point to copy from. Now, typically when you're moving something, you'll pick a reference point on the line, on the object that you're moving. However, since I want to maintain a relationship between this line and the pin, for each of these pins, I'm actually going to pick a reference point on the pin. So once I do that, now it's going to maintain that relationship between the line and where the pin starts. And then I can use that same relationship for each of the subsequent pins. So I'll just start picking now the ends of each of these other pins, and as I do so, then I'm going to get copies of those lines that have the same relationship to each of those pins that the original line did to the original pin. So that makes it really easy to copy a bunch of objects and to make sure that they are maintaining that relationship that you wanted. So it's real quick for me to drop lines here, and just want to make sure all of these have them. Okay. Right. I think that's it. Okay. So this does look like a forest of lines. However, once again, we're going to make these dashed lines. Now, I mentioned before that you could change the line weight in Rhino, and you can do that. And I also mentioned that can be helpful in Rhino, but I also mentioned that it will translate into Illustrator, and that was not true. Once I started trying to do this, for some reason I thought that went over into Illustrator, but it doesn't. So you can just leave the lines as is. The important thing is going to be to put them on a separate layer. And this will become evident when we start using the Make2D function. But what we really need is for these to be on their own layer, so that we can handle them separately once we get into Illustrator. Now I created a layer for this before, and I'm just going to delete that because it's got some geometry on it that I don't want right now. So I'm just going to delete that, recreate it. So diagram, lines, and move these lines all over to that layer. Okay, so now I can turn those off if I want and see what's going on. Alright, so just to see how that looks, let's quickly take this into Illustrator and see how we can work with that. So what I'll do, this is where I want to be I want to use the Make2D command, but I also want to be really careful about the view that I use when I do my export. And so this is where you can just use, if you want to use one of these consistent isometric views as the default, you can see that it moves the camera to a specific position, and for the most part that's fine because it keeps everything in one view. Or I can see everything at once, including my other geometry here. But if I, for instance, were to move all of this geometry further up, it's possible I could get to a situation where everything wouldn't fit. And so I want to give you guys a tool, and this is something I went over in class, to make sure that you can get back to a specific view that you want to reuse later. So, for instance, maybe I want to zoom out a bit so I get a little bit more space to work with, and then I'm going to do my Make2D. but I want to make sure I can get back to this view so that I can reproduce it or parts of it later if I need to. And so I'm going to use the named view panel. That's here under the panels menu, named views. And what that's going to let me do now, when I click save, it's going to ask me for a name. I call it main view, and it's going to save that camera position so I can come back to it later. So if I move around, I lose my place, I can always just come here and double click on it, and it'll take me back to that view. Alright, so now to bring this into Illustrator, what I'm going to do is just select all of it, and I am going to use the make 2D command, and there's a couple options here that are pretty important to set. Current view is fine. The show hidden lines option, that's going to be if you want to like represent in your diagram, represent lines that are blocked by something else or that are obstructed by something else, and you might do that using a different line type or like a dashed line to indicate that something is behind something else. And so if you want to bring those lines in and treat them a specific way, this will let you do that, and what it'll do is it'll actually stick that on its own layer, which is pretty handy because then in Illustrator you can just select all the lines that are on that layer and treat them all the same way. You can apply the same line weight, same line style to them, and you don't have to go and find them and click on them individually. I'm not going to do that right now, but I am going to turn on this maintain source layers option, because otherwise when I export to Illustrator, or rather when I complete this command, it'll just put all of the geometry on the same layer, and then it's going to be really hard for me to separate it once I get into Illustrator. So I want to maintain my source layers, and then I'm going to hit OK. And it's going to think for a while, and then it's going to produce this 2D representation here of my three-dimensional geometry. And just so I don't get that all mixed up with my other geometry, I'm going to group it. And then, you know, I can move it out of the way if I want, but when I export it, the more further it is away from the origin of your document, your Rhino document, the further away from the page it's going to be in Illustrator. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so now to get this into Illustrator, this 2D view into Illustrator, I need to go to my top view so that I have an accurate export of this 2D view, and then I can select all this geometry and hit type export. Now, actually, before I do that, I'm going to zoom in and show you some of what's going on here. The make 2D function is unfortunately not perfect, and you can quickly see that in how there's some missing lines here. There's some of these pins are incomplete, some of them are fine, some of them aren't, and that's unfortunate. I don't know why that happens. And unfortunately that means you're going to have to correct some of that geometry when you get into Illustrator. But just so you know that that's happening in Rhino and not in Illustrator. But it's not too terrible to fix. It might be easier to fix it in Rhino. If you're more comfortable with that, you could just start drawing new lines. Make sure you're on the same or on the layer that you want to be. So if I'm drawing for with the pins, then I would want to make this my default layer, and then I could come in here and start drawing those lines as best as possible. But you're gonna have to be careful about your snaps and things with that. So I might want to turn off my near snap for this, and then make sure my intersection snap is on, and then I turn off Smart Track so it doesn't get in my way, and then I can just quickly draw those in here. It's a little more difficult when you don't have the second circle there, but that's not too big a deal. So yeah, here I just would want to go in and pick an edge, and I'm holding down Shift to make sure that the line stays straight while I do this, and then I can do this a little easier. Alright. So that's the process you're going to have to do to fill in some of this geometry that's missing. And then once you're ready, you can export it. So this is the same process we did before for previous parts of the assignment. Just type in export, choose Illustrator, and then give it a file name. So do that. Make sure your dimensions make sense here. Since we're working with actual dimensions in terms of 10 inches for your board, for instance, for your base, that's fine, especially given that we're printing this out at a really large size. So I'm going to hit OK to export, and then head over to Illustrator, and that's something old, so I don't want that. Alright. Now, with this file that I just exported, once again, this geometry is off to the side, so I have to zoom way out to see it. But first thing I'm going to do is actually change my paper size to reflect what I'm working with. So I'm going to turn on my rulers, because otherwise my default units are in points, and I want inches. So I'll switch to inches, edit my artboard, and now I'm just going to type in 24 by 36 to get the dimensions of my page that I'll be printing later, and then I can get rid of this extraneous geometry and move the main geometry onto my page. Alright, so as you can see, that takes up a lot of space, and you're going to need to be able to fit more on the page than this. So it's okay to scale this down. We're not working to scale here, but I do want to make sure that that stays consistent. And just keep in mind that if you do start scaling things here, and then you re-import geometry from Rhino into this file, and maybe you copy and paste it into this particular file in Illustrator, it's going to be hard to get the scaling right or consistent, across multiple imports or exports, unless you do that precisely. And there's a couple ways to do that. You can do it in Rhino. You could, when you export, actually, instead of doing a one-to-one export, you can actually scale it here. So I could say 1 inches in Rhino, it should equal, 3/4 of an inch in Illustrator, and that would make it come in at 75% of the size that it is here in Rhino. And then I could make sure that the geometry that I'm pulling into Illustrator is always going to be the same scale. The other way to do that scaling, you can do that in Illustrator. I mean, I've shown you that you can scale things this way, but in order to do that a little more precisely, excuse me here, close this, don't save. Alright, to do that precisely, you can go up to the Object menu and Transform, and then go to Scale, and here you can actually type in a percentage. So I'll type in 75% for that, and now it's precisely scaled that down. Okay, so now we want to look at how we might treat this in Illustrator. Notice that all the lines are the same line weight, so like we've done before, you're going to need to look at how we can make things stand out. So I could use the technique I went over in class last time, I think, where I just I want to make my exterior or boundaries of my form stronger than the rest of the geometry, so it just pops off the page a little more. And so you can see here it's actually split up by the other geometry, and that's a result of how Make 2D works. So you're going to have to make sure that you're selecting all the different parts of your geometry, even if they were connected before you used the Make 2D command. So now I can set the line weight here. Now this brings up a point here that you can see here. It's my point weight, my stroke weight is 0.75, and normally when you bring things into Illustrator, it's at 1 point. Well, it was at 1 point, and then when I scaled my geometry to 75%, it actually scaled my stroke weight. Now that's a behavior that can be really obnoxious, especially if you're doing stuff where you're sizing things by hand, and you don't want that to happen. So what you can do, there's an option that you want to tweak for that, And that option is under your preferences in the general section. And there's an option here called Scale Strokes and Effects. And you're just going to want to turn that off to prevent that behavior. So now, even if I scale way down here, oops, well, it doesn't matter what size. If I scale this way down, it retains its stroke weight. It doesn't go any smaller than that. So now I'm gonna bump this up. Going back to what we were doing before, I'm gonna make it a heavier stroke weight on the exterior. So you'll just have to play with that and see what looks good. I might do that also for these, for instance. Now, there's a quick way to quickly select all of the geometry for a given layer. You'll notice that just like the border of my base here, that's all split up. If you want to select all of the blue stuff at once, there's a couple ways to do that. You can use the layer panel, and you can click on where the layer is for this. So if it's all on the same layer and you want to grab it all at once, you can click on the little dot over here, and it'll select all the geometry on that layer. Now that also selects it up here, but it can be a shortcut that'll help you save some time. Alright, but I also wanted to go up here and look at what we had up here, and that's mainly that all of these blue lines. And I'm going to use that same technique to select all of my lines on this layer. I can do it this way, or I can also click on one of these lines, then I can go up to my select menu and do same stroke color. And since all of those lines are on the same layer with the same color, they're all selected at once. Now I can go in for these and I can change the stroke weight. I can make it lighter, and I can make it dashed, and maybe I'll say a 3-point dash and a 3-point gap. And so you can see that those suddenly become a lot less bold, and you can, like I was talking about, you can emphasize the edges of your layers here pretty nicely, and then of course you're also going to want to get it all into black and white, because we're not doing anything here that needs color. So you would change all of your stroke color to black before you're done. You could save this till the end and do it all at once. Okay. Let's do this. All right. So that reads pretty clearly. You can kind of separate out which layers are where, although if I were to do this again, I would want to separate out this bottom layer. It's pretty hard to see how that relates. I might want there to be even more of a gap between layers. One drawing that I've been referencing is this other student's drawing here. They did a good job of doing this, where all of those layers are clearly separate, and they used this technique here where they separated these pins out. Alright, so that's going to be one approach for bringing this geometry in and for separating it. I wanted to show you one other way that you could do it, and that's going to be pretty simple as well. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this geometry because I'm going to show you something else. And then go back to this view. Alright, so the other thing that I wanted to show you, I'm just going to turn off these layers here and just quickly show you guys another way that you can show this relationship between layers and the base, and how they fit together in space. And that's just going to be with a couple of well-chosen lines to indicate just where the edges of these layers are in space. So I'm just going to use the line command that we've used before, set the vertical option, and then I'm just going to start dropping lines from the edges of just a single edge, not everywhere on this geometry, just a couple different spots to indicate the kind of the far edges of that geometry. And just doing those two lines for that kind of places it in space in relation to these other layers and in relation to the base. And then I would just do the same thing for each layer. Oops. And that, you're going to have lines then that drop from each of these layers, but you're not going to have an overwhelming number of lines to deal with. So maybe it would make sense to drop one back here, just because that's kind of sticking out way back there, and drop another one here, and something separate for this because it's a separate piece of geometry. You just have to see what works best for your layout of things, and so that makes it's pretty straightforward to show that way kind of what the relationships are between the geometry and how it reaches the base. So play around with that. It might make sense to have some that are in different depths, so further away from you, to kind of show how that all works together. But just doing that, it's pretty clear how each of these pieces comes down and meets the base. I think it's probably be pretty easy to start dropping more and more lines. Maybe just pick 2 for each, and that'll be consistent and pretty clean. And then, so you would have this diagram as one version, and then you'd have this diagram down here that would show just the pins. Well, actually how it all comes together. So basically, this is what's going on for the layers, and then when they all come together, the pins are holding it together. You could throw the pins up here. Again, you have options. You just need to make some decisions about what you think communicates the clearest. I could put these back here, for instance, and play around with that, see if that works. Or maybe if I don't like that, I could grab all my pins down here, and I could use my selection filter to not select any surfaces and just grab my pins. So I'll just grab my pins and I'll pull them up here, and so I might try something like that and drop lines from each of these pins and see how that looks in close proximity rather than all exploded up here like this. So that's another thing you could try. So I just want to give you some options to keep it simple and also still communicate clearly what's going on. So I hope that helps. Make sure and spend some time in Illustrator to make things stand out clearly. You would want to repeat those line weight type things for each piece of geometry that needs to stand out. This is kind of a unique case. If you've got overlap like this, you might try something where maybe you are following the edges of the form like I showed you to do before. So you might you might want to split some lines. So I could split this, say, right where there's an intersection here. And then I would go and grab this line and this line, and follow the edges of the form, and then make these lines the ones that are the heavier weight. So maybe not 2, but 1 or 1.5 to set it apart. And so then you're taking advantage of those depth cues where the heaviest lines are on the outermost, and then where there's less of a change in depth, the line weight isn't quite as heavy. But since there is somewhat of a line change in depth, maybe it is more than just the most basic level. Anyway, you'll have to play with that. If you need to complete your pins, you can do that here in Illustrator. Hopefully you won't have to deal with this too much, but you can use Shift in Illustrator as well to do this and to keep your lines straight, and make sure all your geometry is complete. All right. Let me know if you have any questions, if there's something else I can clarify, and I'll talk to you guys soon.